The hum of the plane's engines filled the first-class cabin, where passengers seemed to be lost in luxury and their own worries. But the calm was shattered when a white, middle-aged pilot with grim features and an unnaturally rigid posture entered the cabin. His appearance immediately attracted attention, not because it was anything unusual, but because of the way he was tensely scanning the rows. His gaze was fixed on one passenger, a black man in a wheelchair, sitting by the window, looking out at the clouds outside. The man was neatly dressed, wearing a formal suit, perfectly pressed. His manner, like his confident, calm gaze, made him stand out from the rest, but this only seemed to irritate the pilot. He frowned, then stepped closer. His steps were sharp, almost aggressive. His gaze was filled with displeasure, mixed with contempt. "What are you doing here?" His voice was unexpectedly loud, causing the other passengers in the cabin to turn around. The man in the wheelchair frowned slightly, but did not lose his composure. "Excuse me," he answered softly, looking up at the pilot. "You heard me," the pilot continued sharply. "What are you doing in first class?" "I bought a ticket, just like everyone else," the passenger answered calmly, his voice even, but firm. The pilot grimaced as if the words had offended him. He stepped closer, his voice growing louder. "Don't try to lie to me. You're not one of those who can afford to sit here." The pilot's words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Some passengers looked away, pretending nothing was happening. But someone began to whisper. "Excuse me, but what do you mean?" the man asked again calmly, although there was already an icy calm in his voice. "You know exactly what I mean," the pilot hissed. "This class is for people who, well, look different. This is not a place for people like you." The passenger bowed his head slightly, his calm almost tangible. "People like me? You mean for people with disabilities, or are you referring to my skin color?" The pilot gasped, but immediately pulled himself together, his face turning red. "It doesn't matter," he snapped. "Your seat is in economy, or have you decided that being in a wheelchair gives you the right to get into places you don't belong?" The silence in the cabin became oppressive. The passengers began to exchange glances, but no one intervened. The pilot stood, looming over the man, and the man, without changing his expression, looked him straight in the eyes. "My ticket is here," he said at last, taking the document out of his pocket. "I have every right to be here, or are you saying that I am here illegally?" "Captain," the pilot slapped his palm on the armrest of his chair, his patience at its limit. "You want to play the victim? Fine, but I'll tell you straight. You don't belong here, and I'll do everything I can to make sure you remember it." The anxiety in the cabin began to mount. Some passengers began to take out their phones to record what was happening, while others nervously averted their eyes. It seemed that the situation was out of control, but no one dared to intervene. The black passenger looked up at the pilot. There was a calm determination in his eyes that only seemed to anger the pilot even more. "Do what you want," he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "But your actions don't say anything about me. They say something about you." These words fell on the pilot like a mirror, but instead of stopping, he escalated the situation even more. "We'll see how far you can get in that wheelchair," he hissed before turning sharply and heading for the cockpit. The scene ended, but the air in the cabin was tense. This was not just a confrontation between two people. It was a clash of two worlds that had never understood each other, but no one knew yet that this moment would be the beginning of something that would shake everyone on board. The plane climbed, but the tension in first class remained as still as a stormy sky. The pilot, back in the cockpit, looked as if he was trying to control the rage boiling inside him. He glanced at the controls, but his mind was elsewhere. After a few minutes, he stood up abruptly and walked out of the cockpit again. His footsteps pounded like hammer blows down the narrow aisle, until he stopped in front of a passenger in a wheelchair. "You again," he said through gritted teeth, looking down at the man. His face was twisted with contempt. "I thought you'd get the hint and transplant yourself to where you belong." The man in the wheelchair looked up from the book he was holding. His voice was calm, but there was tension in it. "I'm not moving. I have a first-class ticket, and I have every right to be here." The pilot clenched his fists, his face filled with anger. "You and your kind are always looking for privilege," he hissed. "You think that just because you have a wheelchair and," he paused, looking at the man's dark skin, "if you complain about discrimination, that gives you the right to get into places you shouldn't." The man closed the book and looked at the pilot, his gaze icy but firm. People like me, do you really think that skin color or disability make a person less worthy? It's not me who thinks that, the pilot snapped, his voice rising, and the first-class passengers began to glance nervously at each other. That's life, and people like you always get put in their place. You want me to believe that you earned your place in first class, that you pay for it fairly. You don't even know who I am, the man answered calmly, and yet you've already decided that I'm not worthy. The pilot snorted, stepping closer so that his shadow covered the man in the sidecar. I see everything I need. You are a fraud, begging for pity. People like you live on handouts. You always want more than you deserve. And here you are, in first class, as if you were our equals. A man took a deep breath, his hands gripping the armrests of the wheelchair tighter. Are you sure you want to continue? He asked, his voice quiet but challenging. Who are you to threaten me? The pilot exploded. You think you can tell me what to do? I'm in charge here, and I won't let you ruin this flight with your complaints. I'm not threatening, the man replied. I'm just telling you that your behavior shows who you really are. These words, spoken with deadly calm, enraged the pilot. He grabbed the handles of the wheelchair and pushed it forward with force, causing the man to hit his feet on the edge of the seats. You don't belong here, he shouted, and I'll make sure you remember it. The pilot's screams echoed throughout the cabin. The first-class passengers frowned, and someone began recording the events on a phone. But no one intervened. The atmosphere was filled with fear and tension. The man in the wheelchair remained motionless despite the jolt, his gaze fixed on the pilot. You've done everything to show who you are, he said, his voice even. Now it's your turn to see who I am. Who are you? The pilot laughed, but there was a nervous edge to his laughter. You're nobody, just another scammer trying to get by on pity. You'll find out soon enough, the man replied calmly, and there was something in his words that made the pilot take a step back, as if he felt that control of the situation was beginning to slip away. But his rage had not yet subsided. He turned to the passengers, trying to find support. Do you see this? He shouted. He thinks he's better than all of us. He thinks his disability or the color of his skin gives him the right to be here. The pilot's words hung in the air. Several passengers looked away, but some continued to write, and others whispered quietly, discussing what was happening. The man in the wheelchair remained motionless. He knew that now was not the time for unnecessary words. At that moment, a flight attendant emerged from the cabin. Her face was tense, and her voice was trembling. Captain, we have a problem in the cockpit. You need to come back, she said, but the pilot, without looking at her, waved his hand. I have my own problem here, he said, and I'll deal with it. But the flight attendant finally raised her voice. Captain, you need to come back now. We're getting complaints, and this is going to be a serious matter. The words made the pilot freeze. He turned to the woman, then looked back at the man in the wheelchair. His confidence was beginning to crumble, but he couldn't admit it. This isn't over, he hissed, pointing at the man. You'll pay for this. We will both know the price of your actions, the man replied, looking him straight in the eyes. And as the pilot turned and walked into the cockpit, the man knew that his calm was his best weapon, that ahead lay consequences that would turn everything upside down. A heavy silence fell over the first-class cabin once more. The pilot, returning from the cockpit, could not resist another outburst. His face was burning with anger, and the words fell from his lips like splinters. He was clearly intent on destroying the last vestiges of the man in the wheelchair's calm. Well, are you comfortable? The pilot began, stopping in front of the man's seat. His voice was laced with sarcasm, which only increased the tension in the cabin. This seat is for those who deserve it. But you, of course, decided that your special circumstances give you the right to sit here, right? The man looked at him, trying to remain calm. I'm not breaking any rules, he replied, his voice firm but weary. I have a ticket. A ticket? The pilot laughed, but there was nothing sincere in his laughter. And you really think that's enough? You don't understand that first class isn't just a seat. It's a symbol. It's status. It's respect. And you're just a pathetic black man in a wheelchair. These words made several passengers gasp quietly, but none of them intervened. Some turned to the window. Some buried themselves in their phones, pretending that nothing was happening. The man, remaining motionless, looked straight at the pilot. His silence irritated him even more. You think silence is strength? The pilot continued, leaning closer. No, it's weakness. You can't even stand up for yourself. Literally, you can't walk, but you still think you have the right to be here." The pilot turned away and addressed the passengers from between the rows. "Tell me, gentlemen, are you comfortable being around those who are not worthy, who clearly do not fit in here? Would you like your first class to turn into a charity shelter?" Some of the passengers lowered their heads, avoiding his gaze, but some nodded, either out of fear or their own hatred. The pilot turned back to the man. "Did you hear that?" he said, his voice venomous. "No one wants you here, and if it were up to me, I'd throw you out of this plane right now." The man gripped the armrest of his chair, but his face remained calm. His eyes met the pilot's, and in that look, there was an unbreakableness that kindled even greater anger in the pilot. "You still think you're strong?" the pilot asked, his face becoming even more contorted. "You're just a freak of nature, a damn invalid who lives off the money of those who work. You want equality. Equality is a myth for people like you." "That's what you think," the man finally said quietly, his voice even but firm. "But what you say only shows your weakness." "Weakness?" The pilot slammed his hand on the armrest of the chair next to him, his voice breaking. "You dare talk to me about weakness? You, whose life is a miserable existence on society's handouts." The man didn't look away. He knew that his calm was what angered the pilot the most, but every blow, every word, it all hurt him. Despite his outward fortitude, he felt the air in the cabin grow thick, the weight of humiliation pressing down on him, even if he didn't show it. The pilot appeared to lose control. "You think you can win?" he shouted. "You think you can impose your will? No, I won't let you. I'll make you understand where your place is, and it's not here." At that moment, the flight attendant came over again, her face tense but clearly trying to keep her cool. "Captain," she said, her voice shaking but looking him straight in the eye, "you need to get back to the cockpit. This is not up for discussion." "Are you ordering me?" the pilot barked, turning to face her. "This man is ruining our flight, and you want me to just leave?" "No," the stewardess answered quietly. "You are ruining this flight yourself." These words made the pilot freeze, his face twisted with rage, but he said nothing. The man in the wheelchair, hearing this, felt a small glimmer of hope. Perhaps for the first time in all this time, someone dared to stand up for him. The pilot took one last look at the man, turned sharply and headed back to the cockpit, his footsteps sounding like thunder. When he left, the tension in the cabin did not ease, but the man in the wheelchair felt that something had changed. He knew it was not over, but he was ready to fight for his dignity, despite the hail of humiliation that continued to rain down on him. The pilot, back in the cockpit, could not concentrate on flying the plane. His hands were shaking with rage, and his face was pale with anger. He could not understand why his words, his confidence, even his authority could not break the man in the wheelchair. The thought burned inside him, and the more he thought about it, the more hatred he felt. He abruptly tore off the headset, stood up and walked out into the cabin again. His steps sounded hollow, like hammer blows, and his face became even more angry than before. The passengers tensed up when they saw him. Some began to look around nervously, as if they sensed that the situation was getting out of control. The pilot approached the man in the wheelchair again, his eyes blazing with rage. "You're still here," he began, his voice low but menacing. "Why, do you want to test how far I'm willing to go?" The man looked at him calmly, his face showing weariness, but his eyes still showed firmness. "I'm here because I paid for this place," he replied evenly. "I won't do anything to give in to you." You paid?" The pilot laughed, but it was a laugh filled with contempt. "People like you never pay. All you get is handouts. You want equality, but equality is a privilege for those who deserve it, not for people like you." The pilot's words hung in the air like thunder. Several passengers looked on in horror, but no one intervened. One man took out his phone, but quickly put it away, as if he was afraid it would attract the pilot's attention. "Like me?" the man asked, his voice calm but steely. "You judge me only by how I look." "Yes, I do. Damn it," the pilot shouted, taking a step closer. "Look at you. You're black, you're disabled, and you're trying to sit where the people who deserve it sit. But you'll never be one of us. Never." The man gripped the armrests of his chair. He felt every word the pilot said cut through him like a blade, but he didn't look away. "You talk about respect, but your words only prove that there is none, neither in you nor in the system you represent," he said quietly. "The system?" The pilot laughed, his voice growing louder, almost shouting. "You think you can talk to me about the system? The system keeps people like you away from people like me, and rightly so. He looked back at the passengers as if seeking support. You all see this? He continued, his voice growing louder. This is what happens when we allow people like him to think they're our equals. They use their disability, their black skin, to take what is not theirs. The passengers remained silent. Some turned away, some hid their gaze in their phones. But the atmosphere became increasingly heavy. The man in the wheelchair, despite the torrent of hatred, remained calm. You try to humiliate me because you're afraid, he said, his voice quiet but confident. Afraid that your world is crumbling. Afraid that your prejudices no longer protect you. The words, spoken with icy certainty, struck the pilot like a bolt of lightning. He frowned for a moment, but then grabbed the handles of the wheelchair and yanked it forward with all his might, causing the man to slam his legs into the seat in front of him. Your place is not here, he shouted, his face red with rage. And I will prove it right now, the man said quietly but firmly. You have already proven everything. The pilot turned to the passengers, trying to win them over to his side. You agree with me, right? We can't let people like him desecrate what's meant for people with dignity. But at that moment, to his surprise, several people began to raise their phones, recording what was happening. Someone said in a loud whisper, "This has gone too far." The pilot noticed the phones, and a mixture of anger and panic appeared on his face. You think this will change anything? He shouted, pointing at the people with phones. I'm the captain of this plane. I make the decisions. At that moment, the stewardess reappeared in the cabin. Her face was pale, but her eyes were determined. Captain, she said loudly, you are exceeding your authority. I have reported this incident to the control tower. They expect an explanation as soon as we land. The pilot turned to face her, his face twisted. Are you in league with them? He shouted. Are you defending them? The stewardess didn't flinch. I defend the truth, she said. The pilot frowned. There was desperation in his eyes. He suddenly realized that the situation was out of his control. But instead of stopping, he took the last step toward the man in the wheelchair, leaning toward him. You think you've won? He hissed. It's not over yet. This is the end, the man replied, his voice firm. And you brought it on yourself. The pilot stepped back, his face white. He knew that the justice he had tried to stifle was now inevitable. The air in the plane's cabin became thick, as if before a storm. It seemed that even the plane's engines had silenced their sounds to make room for the anger and hatred that emanated from the pilot. He stood opposite the man in the wheelchair, breathing heavily, like an animal preparing for its final leap. His eyes were filled with malice. His hands were clenched into fists, and the words fell from his lips like sharp knives. You think this is going to end well for you? The pilot hissed, leaning closer to the man. His face was red with anger. You want to make me out to be the bad guy. You want everyone to believe you're a sacrifice. But you know what I think? You're not a victim. You're a burden to all of us, to society, to the people who actually work to earn their place here. The man in the sidecar remained calm despite the hail of hatred. His hands were crossed in his lap. His gaze was unwavering, but inside, he felt every word the pilot said cut like 1,000 invisible blades. He knew this man was trying to destroy him, but he couldn't afford to show weakness. Everything you say is your pain, he said quietly. You're afraid of losing control, afraid that your world will no longer revolve around your hatred. The pilot laughed, but there was something wild, almost unnatural, in his laughter. My world, he asked, his voice growing louder, filling the cabin. You're the one trying to destroy my world. You and people like you. You stick your nose in where you're not wanted. You want us to feel guilty for being better than you. But that'll never happen. Never. He turned back to the passengers, now practically shouting. Do you see it? His voice shook with rage. He thinks he can sit here, among us. Thinks that his wheelchair or his black skin makes him above the law, above the rules. But know this, as long as I am here, there will be no one like him among us. Some passengers looked away, trying not to look at what was happening, but there were also those who began filming on their phones. Openly, their actions only fueled the pilot's anger. Are you on his side too? He shouted, pointing at the passengers with their phones. You also think that people like him deserve to sit next to you? Then you are as blind as he is. The man in the wheelchair looked at the pilot. His voice was soft, but every syllable was filled with power. You don't hate me for who I am, he said. You hate me because I remind you of your weakness. Your power is an illusion, And you know it? The words, spoken with deadly calm, hit the pilot harder than any scream. He frowned for a moment, but then the rage took hold of him again. He grabbed the handles of the wheelchair and pushed it backwards, causing the man to hit the edge of the seats. "Your place is down there," he cried. "You've always been down there, and you stay down there." There were whispers and muffled cries in the cabin. Several passengers stood up from their seats, but no one dared intervene. They were afraid that the pilot's wrath would fall on them, too. The man remained motionless despite the impact. He knew this moment was his test. He looked at the pilot and spoke words that seemed to stop time. "Your place is with you," he said, "and my place is where I decide, and you can't change that." These words sounded like a challenge. The pilot, as if losing control of himself, reached for the sidecar again, but at that moment a sharp voice rang out. "Captain, stop." It was the stewardess. She stood at the aisle, her face tense, but her eyes determined. "I will not let you continue. This ends right now." The pilot turned around, his face contorted with rage. "Are you against me?" he shouted. "You want to protect this parasite." "I'm defending human dignity," she replied firmly, "and I've already reported everything that's happening here." These words made the pilot freeze. He realized that the situation was out of his control. He looked at the passengers, at the stewardess, at the man in the wheelchair. They had all witnessed his collapse. "You regret this?" he whispered, his voice shaking, but there was no longer any confidence in his words. The pilot returned to the cockpit, slamming the door. The atmosphere in the cabin remained tense, but now there was hope in the air. The man in the wheelchair looked at the flight attendant and nodded. His look said more than any words. This was not the end. This was just the first step toward the truth. The pilot, back in the cockpit, clenched his hands on the control stick. His breathing was heavy, his thoughts chaotic. Every word the man in the wheelchair said, every calm expression on his face, struck the pilot in the heart. He could not calm down. The man remained for him a symbol of what was destroying his world. His order, his privilege, and this thought fueled his rage more than any fuel. His concentration was broken by a knock on the cockpit door. The stewardess, her face pale but determined, stood before him. "Captain," she said firmly, not looking him in the eye, "the situation is out of control. Air traffic control has advised us that airline representatives and inspectors will be waiting for you upon landing." The words struck the pilot like lightning. He spun around, his face crimson with anger. "What have you done?" he shouted, stepping toward her. "You chose to betray me for this man," she interrupted, her voice shaking but firm. "Yes, because he is a man, and you humiliated him. This is unacceptable." The pilot frowned, his hands shaking. "You don't understand anything," he growled. "Don't you see how people like him take over everything? They destroy our lives, our order, and you took their side." The stewardess did not back down. "I am defending human dignity," she replied, "and I have already relayed all the details of what happened to the controllers. Everything is on record. Captain, this will not go without consequences." The pilot frowned, his gaze fixed on the stewardess, and then moved to the cockpit window. He realized that he was losing control, but his hatred was stronger than logic. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "I won't let it end this way." The flight attendant said nothing, just turned and walked away. The tension in the cabin was so thick, it felt like you could cut the air with a knife. The man in the wheelchair sat silently, his face expressionless. The passengers watched him, some surreptitiously filming the proceedings on their phones. Some were whispering, others were openly expressing their displeasure. One older man, sitting across the row, turned to his wife. "He shouldn't be here," he whispered. "This isn't a place for people like that." The woman nodded. "They always ask for more," she added, "and they always complain that they don't have enough." A young man's voice came from behind him. "Seriously, did you just say that?" he said loudly. "Did you see what the pilot did to him? And you say things like that?" The older man turned to the boy. "Young man, you don't understand how this world works," he replied condescendingly. "My wife and I have been through a lot. We know that they always ask for more than they deserve." The young man snorted. "You don't understand," he said. "This world is changing, and you can't decide who's in the wrong here anymore." His words caused a wave of discussion among the passengers. Some nodded in agreement, while others quietly expressed support for the elderly couple. The tension grew as the plane began to descend. The flight attendant announced, We kindly ask everyone to remain seated. Airline representatives will come on board to clarify the situation." These words made the passengers fall silent. The pilot, hearing the announcement, clenched his fists. He knew that the situation was out of his control, but he couldn't bring himself to admit it. When the plane landed, the doors opened and airline representatives came on board, along with two stern men in suits. Their faces were serious. They went straight to the pilot. "Captain," one of them said, "we're here to get to the bottom of what happened." The pilot was silent, his face twisted with rage and fear. Meanwhile, the passengers began sharing their recordings. One by one, they approached the representatives, showing the video and giving comments. The man in the wheelchair sat quietly, his gaze directed straight at the pilot. Their eyes met. The pilot felt his confidence crumble. At that moment, he knew the game was over. Everything he had tried to hide behind words and rage had become clear. The truth was stronger. The pilot stood at the door of the cockpit, looking at the airline representatives, who entered the cabin with serious faces and folders in their hands. His back was tense, his breathing heavy, but instead of fear, he felt only an all-consuming anger. It seemed that every glance in his direction, every quiet phrase of the passengers, all this was directed against him. And in his mind, the culprit of all this chaos remained one person, a man in a wheelchair. The pilot turned sharply, avoiding the representatives, and stopped in front of the man again. His eyes were gleaming with rage, and his voice was low and menacing, but loud enough for everyone in the cabin to hear. "Are you happy?" he growled, looking straight at the man. "Did you get what you wanted? Turned this flight into a circus, forced us all to endure this show, and all for what? To make yourself look like a victim again." The man looked up at the pilot, his gaze calm, though a tired bitterness appeared at the corners of his mouth. He said nothing, which seemed to anger the pilot even more. "You like being the center of attention, don't you?" the pilot continued, his voice growing louder. "That's what you people like you do. You're always looking for a way to be noticed. You want to be pitied, to be given everything you want without any effort. And then you pretend that you're not the one destroying our world. But that's a lie. You are a lie." The passengers in the cabin began to whisper. Some took out their phones to film what was happening. But the pilot, noticing this, waved his hand angrily. "Take it down," he shouted. "Let the whole world see how people like him take advantage of our kindness to take over everything we've built." The man in the wheelchair exhaled slowly, his face impassive, but there was something in his eyes that made the pilot freeze for a moment. There was no fear or anger in those eyes, only a bottomless weariness from everything that was happening. "You want to talk about kindness," the man said quietly, his voice soft but cutting through the air like a blade. "But what do you know about kindness? About fighting for a place in a world that rejects you? You talk about me ruining your world, but the truth is, your world was never ready to accept someone like me." The pilot frowned, his face turning pale for a split second, but then he slammed his hand down on the armrest of the nearest seat. "You're nothing," he shouted, pointing at the man. "You've always been nothing, and you'll always be nothing. Disabled, black, pathetic. Your life is a complaint. You sit here in first grade thinking you deserve this, but you're just a mistake that needs to be corrected." The pilot's words hung in the air. Even the most silent passengers began to express their indignation. Some whispered, some loudly voiced their indignation, but the pilot did not seem to notice. His hatred overshadowed everything around him. "Look at you," he continued, his voice once again a menacing whisper. "Do you think your skin or your chair give you the right to be here? No, you will never be equal. Your life is proof that equality is a myth, and I will do everything I can to remind you of that." The man slowly raised his hand, as if to stop the pilot's words, but not to protect himself. He wanted to show that he would not participate in this spectacle of hatred. His voice was quiet but heartfelt. "You're right about one thing," he said. "I'm here to remind you of something, that the hatred you so desperately defend won't destroy me. It will destroy you." The words struck the pilot like lightning. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His hands began to shake, and it took a step back. The passengers looked at him with disapproval, and their phones continued to record. "Captain, that's enough," said the stern voice of one of the airline representatives. "You have discredited yourself and the entire company. We ask you to leave the cockpit immediately." The pilot turned around, his face twisted in anger, but he knew there was nothing more he could do. He took one last look at the man in the wheelchair, full of rage and helplessness. "You'll regret this," he whispered before turning and leaving. But at that moment it became clear he had already lost. The hatred he had so fiercely defended had turned against him, and the man in the wheelchair remained seated, looking ahead with the firm conviction that truth was on his side. The plane stopped on the runway, and the atmosphere inside the cabin became unbearably tense. The passengers' eyes were fixed on the man in the wheelchair, who, despite all the pilot's attempts to humiliate him, remained unmoved. The pilot, his face twisted with anger, stood for a moment at the door of the cabin. He seemed to be struggling with himself, not knowing how to continue a fight that he was clearly losing, but his hatred was stronger than common sense. He turned sharply and walked towards the man again. The passengers, noticing this, began to exchange glances. No one knew what would happen next, but the tension in the air was almost palpable. The pilot stopped right in front of the man. He is breathing heavy, his voice breaking into a scream. "You think you've won," he growled, pointing a finger at the man. "You think these phones, these people, this show will make you equal? Never. You'll never be like us. Never." The man was silent, his face calm, but his eyes showed deep fatigue. He knew that his silence angered the pilot even more. He knew that every calm movement of his was perceived by the pilot as a challenge, and it was a challenge that the man had accepted from the very beginning. "You sit in this chair thinking that it makes you superior to us," the pilot continued, his voice growing louder, "but you remain what you are, insignificant, helpless, black. You will always be inferior to us, always." The words hung in the air like thunder. Some passengers gasped, and some turned away, unable to watch any longer. A passenger in the next row clapped her hand to her mouth, her eyes full of tears, but no one dared intervene. No one wanted to become the target of the pilot's wrath. The man in the wheelchair, despite the stream of insults, slowly raised his head. His voice was quiet, but each word sounded like a hammer blow. "You speak of me as if you knew me," he said, "but in reality, all these words speak of you, of your weakness, of your fear." The pilot frowned. His eyes narrowed and his face turned red with anger. He grabbed the handles of the wheelchair again, leaning forward. "You dare call me weak?" he hissed. "You, sitting in this miserable carriage, dare look me in the eye and talk about strength? You are nothing. You have always been nothing, and you will always remain nothing." The man did not look away. His calmness was becoming unbearable for the pilot. It was like a mirror he did not want to look into, but instead of a reflection, he saw himself, angry, lost, helpless. "If I'm nothing," the man said quietly, "why are you trying so hard to break me? Why are you using every second to prove my worthlessness? Are you afraid that your greatness is just a lie?" The words, spoken with icy certainty, made the pilot freeze. His hands tightened on the handles of the wheelchair, but he could not answer. The man's words rang in his head. They struck at the deepest fears he tried to hide. But the pilot was not going to give in. He turned sharply to the passengers, his voice filled with rage again. "You all see it," he shouted. "You see how they are destroying us. They are taking everything that belongs to us. This man is just the beginning. They want to take everything, our jobs, our homes, our dignity, and you let them do it?" Some passengers nodded, their eyes expressing agreement. Some quietly whispered words of support, while others, on the contrary, filmed what was happening on their phones. The split in the cabin became increasingly obvious. Some supported the pilot, believing his words to be true. Others silently condemned him, but did not dare to express their opinion. The man in the wheelchair looked at the pilot again. His gaze was firm and his voice was even. "Your world is not falling apart because of me," he said. "It is falling apart because of you, because of your hatred, because of your fear of what you cannot control." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The pilot took a step back, his face turning pale. He felt himself losing control again, but instead of stopping, he continued. "You don't understand anything," he cried, his voice shaking. "You will never understand what it's like to be in my place. You will never know what it's like to be someone who truly deserves respect." At that moment, an airline representative entered the cabin. His face was cold and his voice was stern. "Captain, that's enough," he said. "You've exceeded your authority. We demand that you leave the cockpit immediately and hand over control to the co-pilot." The pilot frowned. His eyes darted between the representative and the man in the wheelchair. He knew his time was up. But instead of apologizing, he took one last look at the man. "You may win today," he whispered, his voice full of rage, "but nothing good comes to your kind, ever." And with that, he turned and walked out of the car. The man in the wheelchair remained seated, his face calm. He knew that this moment was important. It was not only his victory, but also the victory of all who fought for the right to be equal. After the pilot left the cabin, a heavy silence filled the space. No one moved. No one spoke. It seemed as if each passenger was trying to process what had just happened. The man in the wheelchair remained in his seat, his gaze fixed ahead, but even in that stillness, there was something more resilience and confidence that not even the most intense hatred could destroy. The plane door opened, and a group of airline representatives and federal inspectors stepped on board. Their faces were serious and determined. One of them, a tall man in a formal suit, holding a folder, slowly looked around the cabin. He was clearly looking for someone, and his gaze fell on a man in a wheelchair. That was the moment when everything began to change. "Mister," he glanced at the papers in his folder. "Gray," he said, addressing the man. The man in the wheelchair nodded, his gaze firm but calm. "Yes, it's me," he replied, his voice even despite the tense atmosphere. "We are here to investigate what happened," the representative continued, his voice loud enough for all passengers to hear. "We have been notified of an emergency on board involving unprofessional conduct and unacceptable behavior by the captain of the flight." The passengers began to whisper and exchange glances. Some took out their phones to record what was happening, but now they did not hide it. There was a premonition in the air that something important was about to happen. "We have received numerous testimonies, including video, that show a gross violation of one of the passengers' rights," the spokesman continued, nodding toward those filming on their phones. "We also know that this passenger is not just a passenger." His voice grew louder. "This man is a federal human rights inspector." The words hit like a bolt from the blue. The passengers frowned, their eyes fixed on the man in the wheelchair. Some gasped, some began to whisper even louder. Even those who had been supporting the pilot or silently nodding at his words looked stunned. The pilot, who was standing at the door of the cockpit, turned pale when he heard these words. His hands trembled. He stepped forward, trying to say something, but only a hoarse sound came out of his throat. "Ew, you're joking," he squeezed out, his face twisted in horror. "This is no joke, Captain," the spokesman replied coldly. "Your actions are on record and will be reviewed as part of a federal investigation. We have also received complaints from passengers who have confirmed your inappropriate behavior." He paused, his gaze growing even stern. "Not only did you violate airline standards, but you also acted in violation of human rights laws. This is unacceptable." The pilot began to back away, his face pale, looking at the representative and the man in the wheelchair, as if he realized his world was collapsing. He tried to speak again. "But I didn't know," he cried. "I didn't know who it was." "It doesn't matter. That's where you're wrong," the spokesman replied. "Your words and actions show that you think it's acceptable to humiliate anyone who you don't think meets your standards. That's a crime, and you will be held accountable for it." With these words, the representative gestured to another airline employee who approached the pilot. "Captain," he said sternly, "you are temporarily suspended from duty pending the investigation. We request that you leave the aircraft immediately." "You can't do this," the pilot shouted, his voice shaking. "I'm the captain. This is my flight." "Not anymore," the representative answered coldly. "Please comply with our demands immediately. Otherwise, we will be forced to call security." The pilot frowned, realizing that resistance was futile. His face turned gray, and he turned silently and walked slowly toward the exit. The passengers watched him go with a mixture of condemnation and relief. As the pilot exited the plane, an airline representative addressed the passengers. "We apologize for what happened," he said. "We will do everything possible to understand the situation and take measures to prevent such incidents in the future." He then turned to the man in the wheelchair. "Mr. Gray," he began, his voice softening, "we thank you for your patience and strength. What happened today is unacceptable, and we will do everything we can to ensure that justice is served." The man in the wheelchair nodded. His gaze met the faces of the passengers again. In that moment, it became clear that he had become a symbol of something larger. This was not just a personal struggle. It was a struggle for the right to be equal, for the right to be heard, The passengers began to applaud. It started quietly, but gradually the applause grew louder. The man smiled slightly. For the first time on the flight, he knew that the truth was on his side, and he knew that this moment would change a lot, not only for him, but for everyone who fights for justice. The pilot stood at the foot of the plane, his feet rooted to the ground. He watched as the airline representatives discussed the situation with the men in suits. Every word they said slammed into his consciousness, eroding the last of his confidence. It all seemed like a nightmare. He tried to breathe, but the air seemed to be getting heavier. His fingers trembled, his fists clenched helplessly, and his legs buckled. The situation was beyond his comprehension. He no longer felt in control. The confidence he had so carefully projected in the cabin now seemed a distant memory. Suddenly, one of the inspectors raised his head and looked straight at him. The look was as sharp as a blade. The pilot felt a spring tighten inside him. Everything he had so fiercely defended was now crumbling before his eyes. He tried to gather his thoughts, to come up with excuses, but instead of words, only silence ran in his head. "Captain," one of the inspectors said loudly, tearing the pilot away from his thoughts. "Come here, please." His voice sounded like a command. The pilot frowned for a moment, but then, like a machine, he slowly walked forward. He felt the gaze of the passengers who remained in the cabin. They looked at him, some with condemnation, others with silent joy that at last someone dared to resist his tyranny. Each step was difficult for him, as if the air around him was growing thicker. As he came closer, the inspector looked him up and down before speaking. "Do you understand what you've done?" he said in a level but threatening voice. I was just doing my job," the pilot managed, his voice shaking. "That passenger, he was provoking me." "Provoked?" the inspector asked, his gaze becoming even more severe. "The passenger you insulted is a federal human rights inspector. Do you understand the situation you've put yourself in?" The words struck the pilot like lightning. He felt his heart beat faster. His palms became clammy. He opened his mouth, trying to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. He wanted to protest, wanted to justify himself, but he could not find a single argument. His mind, which had previously been clouded by hatred, was now filled only with fear. "Federal inspector," he muttered, his voice barely audible. He looked at the man in the wheelchair, who was now calmly watching from his seat. This man, who had been the object of his humiliation just a few minutes ago, now seemed like an unstoppable force. "Yes, a federal inspector," another airline representative confirmed, "and we are now viewing your behavior as a gross violation of professional and ethical standards." "But I didn't know," the pilot tried to shout, his voice breaking. "I didn't know who he was." "It doesn't matter," the inspector replied coldly. "Your words and actions are unacceptable towards any passenger, regardless of their status. Your behavior is a disgrace to the profession and the airline." The pilot felt his legs give way. His world was crumbling. Everything he had considered his privilege, his power, was now being turned against him. He had always believed that he could say whatever he wanted, that his position protected him. But now he realized how vulnerable he was. He realized that his power was an illusion, his hatred a weakness. "Please let me explain," he said, his voice shaking, his eyes filled with fear. It was a misunderstanding. "A misunderstanding," the inspector interrupted, his voice as cold as ice. "You call your words, your humiliation, your attempt to break this man a misunderstanding. Do you think that your actions can be simply explained?" The pilot didn't know what to say. He saw how they were looking at him. He saw that everything he said would only make his situation worse. He felt a wave of panic wash over him. The man in the wheelchair slowly turned his head, looking at the pilot. His gaze was calm, but there was strength in it. He finally spoke. "You thought I would just keep quiet," he said quietly, "that you could intimidate me, humiliate me, as you may have done to others, but you were wrong. I am not here to endure. I am here to remind you that the world is changing." The pilot felt his heart clench. Those words, spoken with icy calm, tore apart the last of his confidence. He realized that he had lost everything. His power no longer mattered. His words could no longer hurt. In that moment, he realized that he had become insignificant before the one he had tried to destroy. The inspector turned to him again. "Captain, you are suspended from duty," he said firmly, "and this is just the beginning. You will face an internal investigation and possibly a trial. Your actions are unacceptable, and we will do everything we can to hold you accountable." The pilot nodded slowly, his face ashen. He couldn't respond. He felt empty, broken. His world no longer existed. The man in the wheelchair looked at him, not with triumph, but with quiet determination. This wasn't revenge. This was a truth the pilot could no longer ignore. As the pilot was escorted from the plane, phones flashing and passengers looking at him with disapproval, he felt as if his world had finally collapsed. The fear that had settled in his heart grew stronger with every step. He tried to pull himself together, to find a way to stand up for himself, but he knew it was too late to retreat. Everything that had been said, everything he had done, now served not him, but against him. He was taken to a small office on the airport grounds. The door slammed shut, leaving him alone in a room with nothing but a desk, a chair, and a security camera in the corner. The pilot sat down, but his legs were shaking and his fists were damp with sweat. His heart was beating so loudly, it seemed like it could be heard outside the room. He spent hours in this isolation. His mind was tormented by thought. What would happen next? How would this affect his life, his career, those who knew him? He remembered the passengers, their disapproving looks, how they recorded his every word on their phones. He imagined the videos spreading across the internet, his name becoming a byword for shame. His fears grew like thunder before a storm. Suddenly the door opened and two people entered the room. The airline representative and the same inspector the pilot had humiliated. The man in the wheelchair remained as calm as before, but now his gaze showed not only strength but also deep seriousness. The airline representative put a folder on the table and opened it. "Captain," he began, his voice cold, but not without respect for the situation. "We have conducted a preliminary review of the incident. Your behavior has been found to be inconsistent, including racist remarks, abuse of power, and breach of professional ethics. Do you understand what this means?" The pilot nodded, but his face remained gloomy. He could not find the words to justify himself. In addition, the representative continued, "Your actions have jeopardized the airline's reputation. We have already launched an internal investigation, and you have been suspended from your duties for an indefinite period. Further measures will be determined, depending on the result of the investigation, but rest assured, the consequences will be serious." The pilot tried to say something. His voice was weak. I understand. It was a mistake. I was annoyed. It shouldn't have gone this far." "A mistake?" The man in the wheelchair suddenly spoke, his voice quiet but penetrating. "It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. You chose to humiliate me. You chose to use your power to try to break me, but you couldn't, and now you call that a mistake?" The pilot fell silent. These words, spoken with icy calm, left him without answers. "But I'm not here to humiliate you," the man continued. "I'm here to remind you that every person has boundaries that must not be crossed. Your hatred has made you weak. Your hatred has destroyed you." The pilot lowered his head. He felt every word the man said resonate in his mind. It was not an attack, but a pure truth that was too heavy to bear. "What will happen to me?" the pilot finally asked, his voice barely audible. "That's up to you," the inspector replied. "You can continue to deny and justify your actions, or you can admit your guilt and try to change. The system will punish you for what you did, but only you can decide what your future will be." These words, despite their seriousness, contained an unexpected kindness. It was not a sentence, but a chance. The pilot felt that this man, whom he had humiliated so much, was still giving him a chance to improve, and that made it even harder. The man and the airline representative then left the room, leaving the pilot alone with his thoughts. He realized that his career, his reputation, all of it was in tatters, but he also realized that he had a choice: continue down the path of hatred, or start making a change. Meanwhile, the man in the wheelchair returned to the waiting room, where he was met by members of the press and activists. People who had heard about what had happened had gathered to show their support. For many, he had become a symbol of the fight for equality and justice, but he saw it differently. "This is not about defeating anyone," he told reporters. "This is about reminding everyone that hatred and prejudice are weaknesses, and we must all work to make the world a place where no one is afraid to be themselves." His words drew applause, but he was not looking for glory. He knew his work was not yet done. What had begun as hate was now a lesson that could change the lives of not only those on that flight, but everyone who heard about it. And the pilot remained in the room, alone, in complete silence. Now he could no longer deny the obvious. Hatred made him vulnerable, and justice show that strength lies in kindness and truth. Friends, this story makes you think about many things. What do you think about what happened? Have you encountered injustice or racism in your life? Share your stories in the comments. Your voice matters, and we really appreciate each of you. It is your opinions and personal experiences that make our channel a place where we can openly talk about such important things. If you share our mission to discuss topics like these and make the world a better place, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Your support helps us cover more stories like this. Have a wonderful day full of kindness and justice. Remember, each of us can contribute to a better future.